So this webinar series is part of our Guidepost Guest webinar series. Kayla is going to post some things in the chat about some of our upcoming opportunities. I think that there's something for elementary children that she mentioned. Definitely check out our other talks in the series. There's a bunch of interesting things. I am here today. We are here today with Chloe Baldry. Am I saying your name right? Actually,
yes.
I should have asked you that before the talk. It's like, this is what happens when you know somebody primarily through Twitter. She is super awesome. So she was a Bartley Fellow with the Wall Street Journal, and she spent the last year and a half, am I getting that right? Developing some really creative and powerful social emotional learning resources for adolescents, for adults. And I think kind of her thinking on this issue is very relevant for everybody, for kind of thinking through the present moment, and in particular for thinking through kind of how does education fit into all of this. So I'm excited to chat with her for a while. Ask questions in the chat. You won't be able to unmute yourself, but I will see your questions. Probably won't be able to get to everybody, but I'll start kind of titrating them in as makes sense. So let me just start by asking you, Chloe, about your work. Like, what is your project, this Theory of Enchantment project?
Sure. So thank you, first of all, for inviting me to speak to your colleagues and to members in this network. So I have a startup called Theory of Enchantment. And Theory of Enchantment is a social emotional learning program that is for individuals aged 14 and up, so both teenagers and adults. And this social emotional learning program is really all about teaching individuals how to develop character, how to practice virtue. And it's based on the idea that you cannot really have healthy relationships with others unless you first have a healthy relationship with yourself. So the Theory of Enchantment is a 25-lesson course that uses developmental psychology and pop culture to teach 3 basic principles. And the 3 principles are very simple. They're as follows. The first is treat people like human beings, not like political abstractions, number 1. Number 2, criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down, never to destroy. And number 3, try to root everything you do in love and compassion. And as I said, it's a 25-lesson course, and it uses pop culture to teach it, which is really the bread and butter, and why it's so fun and enriching and exciting. And what that means is, for example, that the first 1/3 of the course is all about understanding the self, understanding what it means to be a human being, understanding what the human condition entails. So making peace with the fact that we are imperfect, for example, making peace with the fact that we all have, to some degree, baggage that we carry, that we bring into the world, whether that's parental baggage, whether that's intergenerational baggage, and learning how to deal with that, learning how to deal with emotions. So we teach Stoicism. I teach Stoicism in the course to help students deal with their emotions. But I teach Stoicism through the lens of both Marcus Aurelius and of, for example, The Lion King. Because The Lion King is incredible. Like I view The Lion King not just as a source of entertainment, but really as a almost spiritual text, because it teaches really individuals how to deal with their emotions, how to navigate mortality, which is a prominent teaching within Stoicism. So anyway, the first 1/3 of the course is all about learning about the self, again, using pop culture to teach it, developmental psychology to teach it. And then the remaining 2/3 of the course is all about taking what you learned and applying it to the other. So now that you know, for example, that you are imperfect, you know that you are capable of producing good and of producing bad. You know that those around you are also capable of producing good and of producing bad. Let's say that you might know, for example, that if you are feeling insecure, you might get defensive, right? I know this about myself, for example. So by studying the depth and the complexity of myself, I can begin to apply that to the other. So if I encounter someone in my life who for some seemingly irrational reason is acting defensive toward me, I can begin to ask the question, is this person feeling insecure, right? And how can I communicate to this person so that they understand that they don't have to feel insecure around me, that they can feel safe around me, and that there's no reason to be acting in this way. So first, students learn about the self, how to have a healthy relationship with themselves, and then they learn how to have a healthy relationship with others.
That sounds awesome. So I want to dive into like each part of that. But before I do, I just like, how did you end up getting into this realm of social emotional learning and creating this curriculum? Like, I'm sure that there's a story behind that. I think I might even know a little bit of it, but like, social emotional learning is a huge thing in Montessori, but I would love to hear, like, in your words, what is it? Like, how did you get drawn to it? And like, what are the goals of like a social emotional learning program?
Yeah, so when I think of SEL, I think of Maslow. Maslow first. I'm a Maslow first person, hierarchy of needs. A person can't really learn arithmetic or science or some of the hardcore subjects if they are coming into the classroom not having their emotional needs satisfied. If they're coming into the classroom, for example, from a poor socioeconomic background, right? And they are, let's say a kid is coming into the classroom and they don't know where the next meal is going to come from. So first of all, we have to deal with that issue, and we have to deal with the fact that that person might have low self-esteem because of that, right? Because their peers and their classmates might be coming from a much more stable background. And so if they're coming from a place where they feel like their basic needs are not met, number one, we have to be able to meet those needs from a material perspective, but we also have to be able to meet those needs from an emotional perspective. I volunteer in the neighborhood. I live in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, and I volunteer at an organization called Children of Promise. Children of Promise mentors kids whose parents are incarcerated. So you have kids who I was once mentoring this kid who was telling me how there was a student in her classroom who she and some of the other girls kind of make fun of. And I'm like, well, why do you make fun of her? And she was like, well, she's really always has a bad attitude. She's really like lashing out. And she said to me also, she sort of has a bad smell in the classroom. And I'm like, well, do you think that maybe she is coming from a household where, well, maybe she doesn't have access to laundry, right? Maybe she doesn't have access to, maybe she isn't able to get all of her clothes washed. And she was like, yeah, I think that is the case. I think that's precisely what's happening. And I'm like, well, do you think that maybe she has probably low self-esteem? She's dealing with a lack of self-worth or feeling of self-worth because of this. And she's like, yeah, that's probably true. And I'm like, well, what do you think people who feel insecure sometimes do when they're feeling insecure? They lash out. Because they're feeling insecure, they lash out. And if you are making fun of her because of this, what do you think is going to happen? And she paused and she goes, I never thought of it that way. And I'm like, yeah, so you can't just look at things from the outside. You have to think in greater depth, and you have to ask yourself, does this person feel like they belong? Does this person feel loved? And if they don't feel like they belong, and if they don't feel like they are loved, how can I contribute to the situation so that they do feel that way? And what are the detrimental steps that I can take that will actually make the problem worse? So you have to look within the situation. You have to look into the depth of things as opposed to simply the superficial aspect of what's happening. And it was cool because at the end of that exchange, we all, like, this is pre-COVID obviously, but we usually form a circle, both the adults and the kids, at the end of every Saturday. And we talk about the things that made us think that we encountered during the day. And she actually brought this up in the middle of, all of the individuals that were there, which was really cool. And she said it made a real impression with her. So I see SEL in my volunteer work. And to sort of zoom out a bit in terms of how I got into this. So my background is actually in international studies and in conflict and diplomacy. So I'm from New Orleans originally. I have a degree in international studies and diplomacy from the University of New Orleans. And I moved to New York 5 years ago. I had a job at the Wall Street Journal. I was really trying to think through, there's in international studies and in diplomacy, there's all of these conversations about how to stop conflict, which is a noble question, right? But there were no conversations about how to get people to learn how to love. And so it always dawned on me that these two things were not the same things. They were interrelated, but they were not the same questions. How do I combat conflict, and how do I get people to learn how to love?
Yeah.
And so I did this research paper at the Wall Street Journal. I worked on it for 9 months, trying to ask this question: how do I get people to learn how to love? And then in the middle of the research, started thinking to myself, well, maybe I have to ask, what is it that people are already in love with? And can I derive a framework of teaching people how to love from studying what people are already in love with? And the thing that people are already in love with, that I discovered to be a wellspring of data, really, was pop culture. And so at this point in the research, I started studying companies, I started studying influencers that have social capital within pop culture. So I started studying Nike. I started studying Disney. I started studying Beyonce. And I wanted to see, is there a meta story? Is there one main story across all of these different influencers and across all of these different content producers? And the meta story that I discovered was all of these individuals and all of these companies do one simple thing. They create content where their audience sees themselves and their potential reflected in the content. And that's it. And that's why we as individuals and we as a culture and we as consumers gravitate toward this content. So for example, Nike is a very simple idea. If you buy this tennis shoe, if you buy this t-shirt, if you buy this jersey, you will be able to quote unquote just do it, right? Which means you'll be able to overcome whatever obstacle exists in your life. And that's the story built into Nike. For Disney, almost every Disney movie ever made is a motif for the human condition. You have a hero who is challenged by an obstacle, who has to overcome an obstacle, who is then transformed by that obstacle, thus maximizing their full potential, right? For Beyonce, when Beyonce says, "Who run the world, girls," many women see themselves and their potential reflected in the content, which is why we gravitate toward it. So that's really the meta story. Show individuals, show people themselves and their potential. So what does it mean to show someone themselves, right? Well, what does it mean to be human? It means that you're imperfect. It means that you are wired for struggle, but worthy of love and belonging. It means that you deal with baggage, right? This is universally true across cultures, across nationalities, across everything. This is fundamentally true. So after I was studying pop culture, or while I was studying pop culture, one of the important books that I read was a book called called Enchantment by Guy Kawasaki.
Yep.
And Guy Kawasaki, he's the former marketing director of Apple. And he describes enchantment as the process by which you delight someone, which in my opinion is just a synonym for the process by which you get people to fall in love with you, essentially. But it's the process by which you delight someone with a concept, an idea, a personality. And so I really gravitated toward this term enchantment because it really captured what I was trying to do in building this framework for teaching people how to love. So I stuck with that term. And after I was at the Wall Street Journal, I worked for a nonprofit for 2 years. And really my job was to refine this concept of enchantment. And I came up with 3 principles, which I stated earlier, to really ground this concept in a framework. And then eventually, as I kept lecturing in college, I lectured all over America at universities and also in Europe on this concept for 2 years. And increasingly, people would tell me, this isn't just applicable to international studies. This isn't just applicable to diplomacy. It's applicable to social emotional learning. It's applicable to DEI. It's applicable to interpersonal conflict and to the quest or the project of developing character. And you should really think about expounding upon this. And so eventually enough people told me that I decided to go independent, to create a company called Theory of Enchantment and to really produce a full curriculum, a full course. And the rest, as they say, is history.
So awesome. I mean, the thing that jumps out to me um, amidst all the amazing, fascinating things here, the kind of way that you're using pop culture, the kind of need for a positive vision, not just like how do we not hate each other, but like kind of what, the use of um, the use of pop culture, both in terms of like marketing and business, and what is the theory there, and art. You have this kind of like Jungian analysis of like Disney,
Yeah.
where there's like a hero's journey. It's actually how philosophical it is. So
Yeah,
I
very philosophical.
I mean,
Yeah.
I have a PhD in philosophy, and like, so part of it is this is just my lens, but this idea that like, look, you have to understand human nature,
Hmm.
like, and the way that you understand human nature is by understanding yourself,
Hmm.
and what the and in your analysis of marketing and enchantment is like, um, you know, it's allowing us to access our potential. Like even that, like what is human potential? What is it that's so inspiring and connecting about that? I don't know. There's no real question here. I could raise my voice at the end and be like, is that not true? Um, but it seems like there's a whole theory here of human nature.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you that like growing up, I was always drawn to, before I got involved in international diplomacy, my first passion was actually screenwriting,
Mm,
and film and screenwriting. And I was always drawn to cinema, and I would always feel just like this larger than life feeling when I would go to the movie theater and see on screen, witness the story of a human being overcoming some obstacle. And also that idea was built in to my early childhood education from the start. Like I went to a school called Langston Hughes Elementary School. The very first thing I remember about that experience was I had to memorize poetry from Maya Angelou. And Maya Angelou's work was always about the triumph of the human spirit, the quest toward liberation and away from enslavement. And so that was something that was deeply ingrained into me at an early age. And as a result, I always gravitated toward other examples of that, that was found in our pop culture, and obviously like Nike really speaks to me, not as a sports brand, because quite frankly, I think Adidas has a better aesthetic these days. But as an idea, I think Nike is what Nike did, what Phil Knight did with that company was very brilliant, and really, capturing this idea of human potential in the branding behind a tennis shoe. It's
yep.
really quite something. It speaks to our psychology and what we
Yeah.
aspire towards.
I mean, I think that's definitely true. I mean, Nike has one of the best brands on earth, and like,
Yeah,
even the name Nike, like victory and
yeah.
the Greek goddess of victory, there's something so eternal about it.
And I would highly recommend reading Shoe Dog if you haven't, because
I have not. I
it's
will
quite the
definitely read
page
it.
turner.
I will
It's
add
about how
another.
he, yeah, it's about how Phil Knight made Nike, and it's a really incredible story.
I'll add another aspirational book to my bookshelf. So lots we could talk about, but I think what I want to hear about, and what I know a lot of people in our audience want to hear about, is how your approach, how the theory of enchantment speaks to the present moment. So there is this huge. I mean, the country's on fire right now. There's a massively renewed focus on race, on inequality, on injustice, and educators everywhere are kind of asking themselves hard questions about like,
Mm-hmm.
what's my role in this? What is the role of the education system? Like, how do I engage with my students? Is there a risk of being too political? Is there a risk of being too cautious? Like, what is your like? I know I haven't actually talked to you about this, but I know that you have thoughts on this from kind of following you.
Sure.
How does theory of enchantment speak to the current moment?
Yeah, it's it's crazy because um, as the current moment is unfolding, the demand for theory of enchantment has risen like nothing I've ever seen before, which is quite humbling to bear witness to. But look, I think it strives to answer this question, which is the question that is at the center of the national conversation, which is not only how do we teach people how not to hate one another, right? Which is at the question of how do we combat racism, and how do we combat police brutality, and how do we combat discrimination. Um, but then bridges out to the question, well, how do we teach people how to love, right? And I think for me, my philosophy is that the way to answer these questions of how to combat all these negative things is to teach people how to love, and to first of all teach people how to love themselves, and then teach people how to love one another. And my curriculum provides, I think, a pretty rich and robust system, a systematic way of teaching people how to do that. And it's deeply rooted in a lot of the great thinkers and leaders who have come before us. I mentioned, Dr. Maya Angelou earlier. So her work is in the theory of enchantment. And by the way, I consider the reason why pop culture is so relevant for me is because I consider all of this pop culture. I think Dr. Maya Angelou's pop culture, or at least should be considered pop culture in the sense that her work should be popular.
It's high literature. I mean, I agree.
Yeah.
It should be popular, but it sounds like you're really, part of what you're doing is kind of in elevating pop culture. You're like bringing in like serious poetry,
Yeah.
And thought,
And I also think that what Theory of Enchantment does, is that it expands the Western canon in the sense that it says that yes, Shakespeare and Plato should be part of the Western canon, but also Kendrick Lamar should be a part of the Western canon. James Baldwin should be a part of the Western canon. Dr. Maya Angelou should be a part of the Western canon. And the way we think of the ideas that should animate our society should not only be sort of high literature, quote unquote high literature, but should also be some of the things that aren't considered to be high literature. So I mentioned Kendrick Lamar. I teach Kendrick Lamar in the first third of the course to teach people how to deal with imperfection, because Kendrick Lamar is a deeply introspective artist. Obviously huge social capital and hugely important in this moment, as he was the only hip hop artist to win a Pulitzer Prize for his work. But in the song, I specifically teach the song DNA. I teach two things from Kendrick Lamar. I teach the song DNA, or a snippet of the song DNA, and I teach a speech that he gave, or a talk that he gave, which was included in one of Jay-Z's albums, actually. But I teach DNA because in it he says, I got power, poison, pain, and joy inside my DNA. And one of the things I love to point out to students is that when he says that, he's articulating his capacity to understand what it means to be a human being, that he's capable of good and of evil. He's capable of destruction and construction. And so by knowing that, by being self-reflective enough to acknowledge that, he can also acknowledge that about the other, but also he can keep the bad at bay, and he can keep the good at the forefront. One of the things we need to understand as human beings, especially in this national moment, is that all of us are capable of evil. And also all of us are capable of good, every single one of us. It lies within the heart of every single one of us, this capacity. And that's very, very crucial to understand, because understanding that gives us the ability to understand that even the most violent, those of us who are the most violent, or those of us who are the most, to use a religious term, sinful, if you will, are also capable of change, right? We're also capable of incredible reform. And I do a lot of work I do some work in the criminal justice reform movement. But in order to advance some of this, we have to, like you said, really deeply understand human nature. So again, my course is all about teaching people about themselves and how to love themselves, and thus be able to love others. I can list some of the sources, the pop culture sources that we teach in the course. So I teach Kendrick Lamar, I teach James Baldwin, I teach John Mayer, because John Mayer actually has a lot of music about parental baggage, which is interesting. I teach Cheryl Strayed, Tiny Beautiful Things, an incredible collection of letters. I teach Brene Brown as well, Dr. Maya Angelou I mentioned. I teach the concept of appreciative inquiry, which is all about how to criticize constructively, and Maya Angelou has a lot to say about this, and this is really, really important right now in our national moment, how to criticize constructively. She has an incredible quote where she says, if you tell someone over and over again they are nothing, they are less than nothing, they account for nothing, they will say to you, oh, you think I am nothing? I will show you where nothing comes. And then they will become even worse than what you have accused them of being. And the moral of this story is that a person cannot develop character unless they are valued. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to say that one more time, because it's very, very, very critical for our moment right now. A person cannot develop character unless they are valued. And I think that we sort of implicitly know this in the education system, or at least I hope we do. Some of us know this. Certainly the Montessori legacy is rooted in that idea. But we sometimes forget that adults are, we're at once children, and adults also need educational and spiritual edification. It's not like once you're an adult, you automatically understand this about yourself and about those around you. So you cannot persuade a person to change unless you believe in their capacity to change, right? And a person cannot develop character unless they're valued. So a lot of the reform that we're talking about trying to implement right now is super important and super good. And we also have to remember that we have to care about the people that we're trying to get to change, because if we don't care about them, we're not going to develop, a holistic approach that is rooted in, what Dr. King called the beloved community. So I think that the theory of enchantment is very, very, very holistic. We have a newsletter that goes out every week, and this week's newsletter was actually about The Lion King and the concept of the circle of life. Because the circle of life is actually a serious and deep idea. It derives from a lot of spiritual traditions, including Buddhism, Taoism, and actually the three monotheistic faiths have certain elements of the circle of life in them. And if you recall, The Lion King, basically the circle of life comes up when Mufasa is trying to teach his son how to remain in this delicate balance. And he says, this delicate balance is between us and the antelope and the insects. Everything is part of this delicate balance. And then Simba says, but Dad, don't we eat the antelope? How's that work? Right? And Mufasa says, yes, son, but let me explain. When we die, our bodies become the grass and the antelope eat the grass, right? And so we're all connected in this great circle of life. And, I thought about this when I thought about, I've been to some of the protests, for example, in Brooklyn, and I thought about how and what we're calling for when we call for police reform, and how to develop a holistic approach to police reform that includes the people and the institutions that we're trying to change. And I thought about the fact that, many police officers experience PTSD. And many police officers experience this PTSD because some of the things that they see on the beat that they're on. And if we don't have social services, for example, in place to help treat these kinds of things, and to say to those whose goal is to protect and serve, that we're not going to also protect and serve you in response. If we don't have those things in place, then what's going to happen is the process that Maya Angelou described, that I mentioned earlier, that if you treat someone like they are nothing, they will act like they are nothing, and they will neglect themselves, and they will neglect you, and then that PTSD will manifest itself in many, many ways, and one of which will be more police brutality, right? So we really have to think, again, I know it's one of my favorite words, but holistically about how
it's a good Montessori word.
Yeah, holistically about how to create the beloved community, to teach people how to love first by teaching them to love themselves. So that's sort of like a 10,000 foot overview of how I would approach some of these questions.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, it really seems like all three of the core tenets of the theory of enchantment speak very directly to. I mean, I could kind of go through them and be like, are we treating people like political abstractions right now? Yeah, everybody's kind of falling into this. Is there criticism that's meant to tear down in an absence of some sort of positive vision? Yeah, and so, I mean, it sounds like the answer that you're giving, the kind of 10,000 foot answer that you're giving, is very similar to the answer that I think a lot of Montessorians would at least be tempted to give, which is you've got to solve this at the root. This is not kind of primarily about, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this is not primarily about anti-racism. This is primarily about what are human beings? Can we develop a positive vision of kind of valuing ourselves and one another, where we can kind of live together in harmony? And then let's talk about the challenges, kind of in that context. And that a lot of your work is focused on kind of really getting that foundation right in a way that is expansive and includes pop culture and diverse sources, and like it like includes people who are going to be able to kind of speak directly to some of the challenges of the moment, kind of
Yes.
while you're building the foundation. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think it's an integrated approach to
Yeah.
anti-racism. It's an
Yeah.
integrated approach to, diversity, equity, and inclusion from the ground up, not a top-down solution. And it really grapples with, again, the human condition and asks, how can we navigate some of these things that we always run into, like I keep coming back to imperfection, but so much unnecessary hatred comes when people aren't able to deal with their imperfections, to deal with the fact that they are imperfect. It comes from people being unable to deal with that and thus overcompensating for it, right? Talk about bravado. You talk about, there's a great quote by this Nigerian artist, Jadena, who says, our bravado is dripping with cowardice, right? So it's like this idea of overcompensating for your insecurities instead of becoming comfortable with your insecurities then leads to so much both personal and interpersonal and societal confusion, malevolence, chaos, disruption, and destruction. And so the question is, so how do we work backwards, right? As you said, to get at the root of that. And then let's try to get that to as many human beings as possible. Let's try to get that to as many institutions as possible. We talk about, training of this nature has to be long-term because we're talking about human relationships. We're talking about human beings. The process of enlightenment in my opinion, takes a lifetime and has to be renewed daily. You have to dedicate yourself to that daily. So yeah, it's a long-term thing. It's a bottom-up approach, and it's rooted in an understanding of human nature and trying to make peace with our human nature so that we can get along better with each other.
I mean, what would you say? I see a couple of questions in the chat, so I just want to acknowledge that, and I will get to them.
Sure.
Thanks, Eva Claire. Bernice says that she's also from New Orleans and also loves The Lion King. I mean, what would you say to an educator or even a student who kind of came back at you and said, look, I don't necessarily disagree with what you're saying in principle, but like, what this moment calls for is not necessarily self-reflection. What this moment calls for is like a recognition of systematic racism and like action and like acknowledging the fact that like, like it's not me, it's you. Like I've been victimized here, and something like, I mean, I could easily imagine somebody being like, something is wrong with this orientation. I don't know to what extent you've encountered this, but
yeah, no, it's a good question. I would first of all be very pleased that the student is seriously grappling with the work, right, and asking difficult questions. So kudos to that student who would do that, and I would just start to engage with them seriously and say, well, what is the goal of the movement? What is the objective? What is the prophetic vision of the movement? What aim are we working towards? And then try to work backwards from there. And I think I would be able to pretty persuasively demonstrate that without self-reflection. And we saw this very much during the Kingian philosophy during the civil rights movement. Self-reflection was at the heart of that, movement in many ways. But if the goal is to create a more just society, if the goal is to create a society where human beings treat one another with the sense of dignity that they deserve, how would you be able to treat someone like that if you do not feel that way about yourself? And vice versa, right? So why would someone who is walking around with a sense of or a lack of self-worth be able to engage in the kind of justice work that you're describing? They would not be able to do that, right? So I think this would be a question of first principles, right? You cannot engage in justice work if you do not have a healthy relationship with yourself. If your sense of your relationship with yourself is very much incomplete, and is very much on very shoddy foundation, you will not be able to build anything that will sustain itself. What you will end up doing is creating a sense of justice or something that makes a mockery of justice, right? Because you don't even have a healthy relationship with yourself. How can you begin to advise people on how to build a society in which we are in a healthy relationship with others? And I would obviously show evidence of that to that student,
Yeah.
and we would talk about we would go through some of the course material that actually indicates that. I'll give you a quick example, actually. So, so there's a story I like to tell about this guy Randy Furness and Aaron Courtney. So it's a true story. So this happened a couple of years ago at the University of Florida. A neo-Nazi came to speak, and there was a sea of protesters that stationed themselves outside the classroom. And Randy Furness at the time identified with the white nationalist movement, and he had Nazi signs all over his t-shirt. It was very, very obvious who he stood for. But in order to go see this guy speak, he had to walk through the sea of protesters. And once he started walking through the sea of protesters, many of them started cursing him out. You know, they started punching him in the face. They started causing blood to draw. And all of these various things. And now one could argue that these individuals probably were trying to pursue justice, right? That was clearly an act to try and pursue justice. Their intentions were very good. Another gentleman by the name of Aaron Courtney, who's an African-American man, sees Randy Furness for the very first time, has no idea what to do, is seeing someone for the very first time in his life who hates him for his skin color. And so he does the thing in that moment that he is moved to do, which is to say that he hugs him. Now, in the moment that he hugs him, it's almost as if the entire universe comes to a pause. He hugs him and he pulls him close, and he asks him 3 times, "Why do you hate me? Why do you hate me? Why do you hate me?" And at this point, Randy Furness has no idea what to do, because the object of his hatred is hugging him, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he does the thing in that moment that he's moved to do, which is to say that he hugs him back. And he says to him simply, "I don't know." Now, this simple exchange sparks a total change and a total transformation within Randy Furness, who has since disavowed his ties to the white nationalist movement and has made steps and made inroads with the African-American community in that area. And it's interesting because when we think about the concept of justice, it's like, which entity or which group or which individual produced more justice in that interaction? But what's even more important for the sake of this conversation is that if you were to look into Randy Furness's background, you would discover that he actually had been suicidal in his early 20s, and he had tried to kill himself in his early 20s. Now, if you know anything about the research behind sort of supremacist ideation, this is a common thing. This is a common thing. We found in our work that a lot of these individuals tend to be suicidal and tend to have a feeling of worthlessness, and then a group swoops in and then exploits that insecurity, takes advantage of that insecurity, and says, "You know what? We are going to give you something to fight for. We are going to give you something that will give you a sense of worth, that will make you feel worthy, that will make you feel like your life is worth living." And this is what the white nationalist movement did. They saw him, saw that he was insecure, took advantage of it, and exploited it. Now, the question as educators and as change agents is Are we going to be capable of being that other group, right, that says to the white nationalist movement, "Not on our watch. You are not going to come in and exploit the insecurities of this individual or of these individuals. We're going to actually care for them. We're going to actually show them that we do believe in their sense of self-worth. We're going to correct them when they need to be corrected, but you're not going to exploit this." And by the way, just want to give a quick shout out to Disney, because a lot of Disney villains have that same profile. So if you study Frodo from The Hunchback of Notre Dame, if you study Ursula from The Little Mermaid, this is their bread and butter. These are villains who exploit the insecurities of the hero and try to rope them in and try to get them to follow a nefarious cause. So that was a very long answer.
No, it's a great, I mean, yeah, so look, I mean, I could not agree with you. I mean, I'm very paranoid right now, kind of taking the 10,000 foot view of the culture of like, things that violate all three of your principles happening at a cultural level,
Sure.
you know, like treating people as inhuman, tearing people down, and then educators, not caretakers, parents, not properly recognizing that, like, you're going to create an entire generation of people who could be taken in by the white nationalism. I mean, I think we've seen kind of like echoes of this.
Sure.
We've seen this happen in history, and we've seen echoes of this happen in America even recently. So that makes a lot of sense to me. I think I mean, it's hard. I mean, it's hard to kind of separate yourself from the culture wars as an educator, and there's a question as to kind of how much you should. But I mean, there is a view that, like, what, like, our Black students and our Black educators, we have to reckon with the fact that, like, America is a fundamentally racist place, and this is kind of part of what they're coming into, and part of what we're doing in kind of correcting justice work. It is about, like, it's more external facing than internal facing, and so
Yeah.
I think that there's a dynamic, there's a dialogue. I think it's like a healthy dialogue, but like,
Sure.
I mean, I can kind of like even think about channeling some of our educators and responding to what you're saying. I think that there would be pushback.
Yeah, I welcome it, and again, but again, I maintain that if a person at the forefront, if the people at the forefront of the justice work do not understand themselves deeply, and do not have a healthy relationship with themselves, and do not have a healthy and I see themselves only as political abstractions, right? Which is another issue. And sees thus everyone else and treats everyone else as political abstractions, then the justice movement will not be sustained. And we've
I mean,
seen
some of this comes down to, like, you know, what is the positive vision? I mean, that was your kind of starting point in your 10,000 foot view. It's like, look, if I can get the student or the educator to be like, what am I actually trying to accomplish here? Then you can start to work into, like, self-reflection.
Right, and then you just work backwards, right? You just work backwards. There was something that I wanted to say, but I forgot. Maybe it'll come to me at some point.
So I have a couple questions that are on this. One from Carrie Ann, one from Melody. I'm just going to start with Melody's and work backwards. What do you say to a person that has already reflected and loves herself, but their lived reality in society keeps saying, I hate you, you are not valued?
Great question. So then if you love yourself, then you know that you are valued. And it's also important to keep in mind that when others tell you that you are not valued, and this is really, really important, it's important to keep in mind that that's not about you, right? That's about them. That is their insecurity being projected onto you. I just had a conversation the other day I moderated a conversation with prominent African-American members of Major League Baseball. 5 guys, to get their take on this and to ask them, you know, how they grew up and what their experience in Major League Baseball with their teammates and dealing with these things. And they said something similar. It's like, when someone is acting out towards you in a malevolent way, you have to understand, and this is what someone, I think, this is, you know, the character of someone who truly understands himself and truly knows their self-worth. You have to begin to understand and internalize that it is not about you. It has nothing to do with you whatsoever. There's a man that you may be familiar with by the name of Daryl Davis, whose claim to fame, well, he has 2 claims to fame. One of his claims to fame is that he's a famous musician, like really, really good musician, and has played with some of the best, including some who actually basically invented rock and roll, like Chuck Berry, for example. But his other claim to fame is that he basically gets people to leave the KKK. And I interviewed him for my podcast about this, and I was like, but you know, when you first encounter these people, aren't they like saying crazy things about you? You're a Black man. They're like really being obnoxious and insulting and hateful. And he's like, yeah, but that has nothing to do with me. I know who I am, and I know my self-worth, and I know what I bring to the world and my intrinsic humanity. It has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with them. And I think that that's true. And I think that it's definitely hard to internalize that sometimes, which is why the work of self-knowledge is a daily thing that has to be, I think, practiced every day. But that would be my like without delving into coursework answer.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with you. And I know it feels like it has something to do with you, but you know that you are not X, Y, and Z. You know that you're not worthless. You know that you are a beautiful, amazing, incredibly talented person full of potential. It has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with them.
Yeah. So, I mean, to put that in my own words, it sounds like the more confident that you are in your own nature and worth, the more it robs the reality of the counterclaim. Like, it's just like, that's
Yeah.
false. Where's this
Not,
coming from? Is
yeah,
this
yeah.
like, I don't know where you're seeing this. I'm not seeing it. You know, it's
Yeah.
like and then it becomes like diagnostic. Like, where is this coming from
Right.
within you? Because it's not coming from
Right.
within.
Which I have a slight addiction to doing that. I'm always like looking for the diagnosis in human beings. But I actually just recently watched Michelle Obama's documentary Becoming on Netflix, and she there's a lot of conversations that she's having, especially with young Black girls, about this, and she talks about this as well. So I highly recommend that if you guys haven't seen it.
So we have the sort of the opposite question from Carrie Ann. For those who don't love themselves, and I'm very close to a few who don't love themselves, which is very painful to see, it seems nearly impossible to persuade them that they're worthy, lovable, amazing, and loved. How can one address another through that kind of self-hatred? Where to begin when loving words and actions aren't enough?
Yeah, so unfortunately, you can't make another person love themselves. You can try to influence them. You can try to persuade them, but ultimately it's going to have to come from within, which is why there's no guarantee to any of this, right? I'm just saying that the likelihood is more with Theory of Enchantment, but you can't. You can only try to be there and facilitate. Daryl Davis famously said that, like, I never converted anyone. They decided to convert themselves. I just helped them along. So unfortunately, and this might not be a satisfying answer, you can't make someone love themselves. They have to decide. They have to get up one day and decide, you know what, I am worth something. I am worth it. I am worth fighting for. But that's something that that's a decision that they have to make on their own. You can't do that for them.
I mean, it seems like, the Theory of Enchantment would help with this. And in general, what Montessori would say is, like, you can't make somebody love themselves. You can't make somebody love others. You can't make somebody love anything. But what you can do is help them understand. And love is very connected to understanding. And misunderstanding is a big blocker of love. And I feel like you're underselling. I mean, yeah, you can't make somebody love themselves, but like you can kind of engage with people and inspire them to understand something about themselves that they wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah, and I think like when I think of this question, I think like I teach the song "How to Love" by Lil Wayne in the course, which is specifically about a young woman who does not know how to love because she did not receive love. And what I find in terms of a pedagogical approach is that when you bring texts into the classroom that reflect individuals, that reflect individuals' experiences, it totally changes their experience of that experience, because then a person might think to themselves, I thought I was the only person who was feeling this way. Turns out this other person was also feeling this way, which means that I'm not alone, which means that there may be something that I was missing in my understanding of reality, which means. So yeah, I obviously think that engaging with certain texts, which brings about understanding, can help facilitate that process. So you're totally right. I was underselling it, but again, that person ultimately will be the person who comes to that conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, that's another very Montessori. There's no bypassing human agency at the end of the day. Like, educator, like, we're not about, like, we can't make anybody do anything. We can't, like, we have to kind of trust the individual and their power of choice and their, it's a hard fact to face as an educator, but I agree with you. I think it's a true one. We have a question here that I knew somebody was going to ask. Sure. I don't know what you want to say about it. How would you envision applying these principles working with families with young children, particularly approaches for parents and for children individually and collectively as a family?
So early childhood education is not my area of expertise, but there are a lot of parents, like I said, I teach this course to adults as well. So I would actually have the parents themselves and the teachers themselves go through the training. Especially teachers who already have early childhood education experience, because then they can take what they learn and then apply it to some of the things they're doing in the classroom in their own way.
And so you see it, I mean, how do you see it helping? Is it that like the educator or the parent becomes more secure within themselves and thus better able to interact with their child, or is it like they see analogies to use, or both? Or
yeah, so the reasoning in the theory of enchantment is very much driven by analogies, and I think it would be a combination of both. I think the parent and the teacher who take the course would just have a much more expansive understanding of both themselves and the world around them, and then they would be able to, because they would be trained to look for analogies in the because of the course. They would then begin to look for analogies in their own experience that apply to early childhood education. There are some things that sort of dovetail with early childhood education, like Inside Out is one of the films that I teach in the theory of enchantment, which I know was psychologists who work in early childhood education were consulted for the making of that film. So there is some overlap, but in general, I'd say, again, your worldview would be expanded, your understanding of yourself would be expanded, and then you would logically apply that to your specific situation.
Yeah, I think some of it depends on how young a child you're talking about. Sure. It's like, are you talking about like a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, or are you talking about 4 or 5-year-olds who can read and like is going to watch Disney movies, and like you can kind of engage with them about that. I mean, I think a lot of the core principles you've talked about, some of them are in Montessori already. I think a huge part of what you've been saying that's like implicit and quasi-explicit in what you said so far is like, you're engaging with people who are kind of people who are in your resources for you, in your curriculum, are like, diverse Black leaders and artists, or members of the civil rights movement, or like there's a kind of diversity component to your curriculum. And I think definitely that has to be part of the story for early childhood too. It's like, who is the child interacting with? Who are they being exposed to? What stories are they being told? So that's another thing that I would jump in and add.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I was 6 years old when I was memorizing Maya Angelou. That has a huge impact on one's conception of oneself.
Yep, totally. A bunch of questions. We're going to get to the point where we can't do all of them, but Melody had a follow-up, so I wanted to give her first crack. She wanted to rephrase, what do you say to a person that has reflected, that loves herself, but their lived reality in society does not grant them access to the same opportunities as other people because of their ethnic background? So kind of getting at this idea of like, they're grappling with like, not just like people being mean to them, but like a real kind of existential network of, injustice.
I struggle with this question because, as a Black woman, I feel like I was always taught, and maybe this is my, this is my parents, this is the educational experience that I received. I was always taught that there's always something. There's always a possibility. There's always a way to create. Well, first of all, I'll say two things. From the child's perspective, from a young person's perspective, whose brain is in the process of developing, right? This person might not know this, right? But I think I would say, if they feel this way, it is up to the educators to be mentors and to be resources to and for this child, and to and for the young people, to show them that there is something, that you are there for them, that you can assist them, that you can help them, that you can show them and give them access to opportunities. I think that's what our role is as educators, and and that we do have the power to do that. I have had a lot of mentors growing up. I've had a lot of people, and especially teachers in the English language department, give me wise counsel. And so I don't think my philosophy is not that there is always nothing to latch on to. I think, and especially again, as we have the autonomy and we have the power as educators to be that person that goes to that young person and says, I know you're grappling with these very terrible issues, and I know that you think that the entire world is against you, but actually I'm here for you, and I'm a resource, and I'm a mentor, and I'm a role model for you, and I can help you. So I think that the onus really is upon us as educators to be that person towards someone who's experiencing that.
Great answer. Question from Peter: what is at the root cause of a human being's developmental ability to love themselves and to recognize their inherent worth? Love, I'm eliding a little bit. Love is a broad word that by itself has become an abstraction with many meanings and understandings. I think the question is kind of like how do you kind of, what's going on here at root? How do you bootstrap that process? It's similar to some of the questions that have been asked. But
well, I mean, I think the theory of enchantment is supposed to serve as a roadmap to like teach people how to do that. Obviously, that's a how long do you have? Like, that's like a 2-hour question that requires. I can tell you, again, I can tell you about my educational experience growing up. I learned. I as I said earlier, I went to Langston Hughes Elementary School. My conception of America was very much of an America that contained African American history. So like I saw on Twitter, someone tweeted out, how many, like when was the first time you had a African American teacher? And people were saying college, and I was like, what? Like my first African American teacher was in like kindergarten. But my understanding of history and my place in it, and my place in American history, was never to be dismissive toward our incredible sins that we've committed in this country, but always understanding the strides that we've made in this country and the legacy that the forefathers and mothers of this country have created, which include the legacy of Dr. King, which include the legacy of Maya Angelou. Like, it always loomed large in my head that, it wasn't just George Washington and Thomas Jefferson that were the founding fathers. It was also King. It was also Rosa Parks. It was also, the great Harlem Renaissance writers. So my conception of America was always both the good and the bad, always in tension with each other, always struggling with each other, always striving with each other. And so I don't know, that just that big, larger view of history coupled with parents who gave me a sense of self-worth or imbued me with a sense of self-worth really made me, I guess, or gave me the feeling of self-love. And I'm really reducing this answer for the sake of time, but like my vision of myself set against the backdrop of American history is not a pessimistic one.
Yeah, it's part of what I'm getting from your answer is that there is a kind of sense that you're responsible for helping a child form as to like not just like themselves in some sort of encapsulated way, but like where do they belong? Like where do they fit into all of this?
Yeah, to give them a sense of belonging. 100%.
Yep. We have 2 minutes left. There's a question that I really want to sneak in.
Yep.
But you can demur if you feel like this is another dissertation level question. So this
I'll
is a
try my
question
best.
I got before the talk. So the first principle of the theory of enchantment, can you just state it again, since I know people sign in line?
Treat people like human beings, not like political abstractions.
So how do you think race?
I can tell this is going to be a good question.
How do you think race fits into this? So there are people who there's the kind of colorblindness ideal where race might matter, but it's not morally significant. There's the race consciousness practices where it's like, no, like embrace your like kind of see, like, what is
split the difference between those two?
You split the difference. So say more about that. Yeah.
This is a great question. It is a dissertation level question. This is the question really at the heart of this, and I've sort of written in my diary about this from time to time. It's like, where's the essential self to be found? Mm-hmm. Right? Is it racial? Is it gender? Is it a combination of all these factors plus something else that kind of transcends all of these factors, which I tend to land on that. But I'm going to answer the question by not answering the question and by giving you a homework assignment, everyone.
Great.
You need to, in order to answer this question, you need to read the book Shadow and Act by Ralph Ellison.
Okay.
So I'm sure many of you are familiar. Ralph Ellison wrote Invisible Man. And
Yep.
what's interesting about Invisible Man is at the time it was written, it was not considered, the critics did not consider it to be simply a book about race, even though it was a book about race. It was a really, critics considered it to be one of the great American novels, right? Not just a great book about race in particular, not just a book about the African American experience, but a book about the American experience writ large as told through the African American lens. There's a great quote that I love that says, "Out of the particular lies the universal." So I would say read that book, Shadow and Act. It's an incredible book that really answers more in depth this question. Go visit the African American Museum in DC, the Smithsonian, because that museum is specifically designed in quite a incredibly amazing way. So if you've been to this museum, it's 4 floors. It starts, the first floor is really about the history of slavery, which makes sense because the first floor is kind of like in a basement. It's like in the depth of a ship, right? Almost, which makes sense. And then it goes up, and the 4th floor is all about the artistry that African Americans have contributed to the world. And that design is purposeful because what it's doing is it is a design that's embodying the concept of transcendence. It's literally, you literally rise from slavery to the artist, right? To the perspective of the artist. And that's super important in thinking about this question that was posed. So that's your second assignment. Go visit the African American Smithsonian.
That's awesome.
The last thing I'll say is a quote, hopefully I'll remember it. It's a quote from James Baldwin from his 1948 essay, "The Problem with Protest Novels," which is very relevant in our current moment. And I teach this essay in the Theory of Enchantment course. So he says in the last paragraph, he says, "The problem with protest novels lies in its rejection of the human being, in its rejection of his beauty, his power, and his dread, and in its insistence that the only thing that is real is category, and that the human being cannot transcend it." So I split the difference between those two positions that you described earlier. I don't believe in a colorblind society. I think that there's an incredible richness to the African American tradition that we contribute to this country, that we've built within this country. So I don't believe in the rejection of that, but I also don't believe that it is everything, that it is the only thing. And as human beings, as an African American human being, I think I contain multitudes, and I contain all of these things, and I also transcend all of these things simultaneously. And that is the beauty and the paradox, and that's cool.
Thank you that's a great place to end on that way more than adequate answer to an impossible question. So you've given us a ton to think about. I posted in the chat just now, theoryofenchantment.com is the Theory of Enchantment website. You can follow Chloe on Twitter at @cvalder. You can also follow, I think it's @enchantment theory. Is that right?
Yes.
Anything else that you'd like to plug?
Yeah, I mean, if you'd like to check out the curriculum, we have different ways you can. So visit theoryofenchantment.com. We have things set up for teachers as well. There's a free resource you can download at theoryofenchantment.com. It's a resource. It's a brief guide that teaches you how to use Disney to teach social emotional learning in the classroom. So be sure to get your hands on that. Again, it's free for all teachers and anyone who wants to download it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This has been a really super fun conversation.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Chloe. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.